All right, let's finish up the book. Arthur's Good Idea. Good, there we go. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Agnes, over there. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves," and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering and the staring stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, super skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. Flat." "Shame on them," Mrs. Lambchop said. So before, Stanley was really enjoying being flat. He was finding that he could do things a little bit differently. Remember, he could go in the mail and go all the way to California and visit his friend. He was able to slide underneath doors. He was able to help his mom find her ring. Those are things that he wouldn't have been able to do in the ways that he did because he was flat. So now is kind of getting teased, and people aren't being very nice to him. And so that's another problem in our story. And that's something that maybe a lot of people deal with. People that are not nice because people are different, and that's just a bummer. It's just disappointing when people aren't inclusive. People aren't accepting of other people because they are different. And I know that this is a little bit silly because Flat Stanley is flat and squished but we can kind of use this story in our real lives. And so kind of compare that. What does that look like if somebody is being a bully? What does it look like when people are not being nice? What do people do when somebody looks or says something different? So this is kind of a story that we can use for a lot of different things. We can use it as a great adventure story, that he's able to do things so differently. I mean, he was able to catch some thieves, which is really awesome. He may not have been able to do that if he, wasn't flat. And then we can also use the story as even though you can do things that are different than everybody, it doesn't mean that that's better or worse, So this story can really help us out in a lot of different ways. "Shame on them," Mrs. Lambchop said. "It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion for that matter, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said, "only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. You're still mad because I get you tangled the day that you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Just go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley, just tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again like other people. I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." Okay, so before, remember, Arthur was feeling a little bit jealous. He wanted to be flat like Stanley. Remember, he put the books all on top of him and tried to squish himself down. So you might have heard people say the grass is not always greener on the other side. And that's reminding you that what you have is sometimes enough. You think that other people have things that you want, So Arthur was thinking, "Oh my goodness, I'm just still a regular boy and I wanted to be flat like my brother." And but now he's noticing that being flat like Stanley may not be the best thing ever, because Stanley's not really feeling like it's the best thing ever anymore. He's feeling like he doesn't really want to be different, and he doesn't want to be squished, and he doesn't want people be making fun of him. So let's see if we can find a solution, because right now they're both feeling upset for wanting what the other person has, and we see that a lot in just kind of our everyday things. You kind of wish that you had something else. All right. Oops, sorry. Okay. "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse." So when he says folks, that means his mom and dad. "You're brave, Arthur said. "You really are." He took a hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the darkness, being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better than they had before. And then, suddenly, though he wasn't even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where the toys and things were kept. He began to rummage through the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and airplane models and a lot of wooden blocks, and then said, "Aha!" He had found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. Okay, so the problem that we've had since the beginning of the story is that Stanley all of a sudden became flat. Okay, so during this entire story, there were other problems, right? His mom lost her ring. There were thieves in the museum. So there are other problems along the way. He wanted to visit his friend and couldn't afford a plane ticket. And all those problems ended up having plans and solutions. The problem that we've had this since the beginning that we have not solved, that we don't have a solution for yet, is Stanley becoming flat. So now his brother Arthur has found a bicycle pump, which is usually used to pump up air in a tire of a bike. So, do you have an idea of what that could be used for? All right, let's see what they say. Okay, Stanley said at last, but take it easy. He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and clamped his lips tightly so that no air could escape. Please don't do this at home. I'll go slowly, Arthur said. If it hurts or anything, just wiggle your hands at me. He began to pump. At first, nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped. Then suddenly, Stanley's top half began to swell. It began to get larger. It's working, Arthur shouted, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get around inside him more easily. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons of his pajamas top started to burst off, pop, pop, pop. A moment more, and he was all rounded out, head and body, arms and legs. But not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons. You know those balloons he's talking about? The ones that you blow and then like this much, and then there's a little bit hanging and you have to keep blowing, so the whole thing. Maybe a little shake would help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out as much as the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop, as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you very much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. We heard you, said Mr. Lambchop. Up and talking? You ought to be asleep. Shame on George, said Mrs. Lambchop. I think this is the first time that we've heard his name. Oh, wait, no, at the park. Stanley's round again. You're right, said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. So Arthur is finally getting some recognition. Remember, all the story, all he wanted was a little recognition, and Stanley just got all the attention because he was flat. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and they turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon, all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. Sorry. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the story. And I hope you are looking in your mailbox soon for something special that will be coming. And we will talk about that when it happens. All right, take care, guys.